1958, an organization called AIM, the American Indian Movement, was established to advocate for Native American rights in the United States. Agitated by generations of abuse through breaking treaties, stripping sovereignty, stealing land, and a consistent battle over civil rights, these activists decided to rebel against the government that continued to neglect them. In 1972, after organizing and informing their fellow protesters, the leaders of AIM led a march from St. Paul, Minnesota to Washington, D.C., which they termed the Trail of Broken Treaties. Once they reached the nation's capital, they occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs building for 6 days. The activists barricaded themselves inside, scoured through government records, and threatened to release incriminating evidence of American Indian abuse. The president of the time, Richard Nixon, while still seeking re-election, was careful in his reaction to these protesters. Mindful of his image, Nixon ensured these protesters that he would evaluate their 20 points paper and in turn reform the U.S. government to better suit their needs. By clearly listing their demands and by showing a steadfast dedication to their cause, these revolutionaries forced the government to publicly react, leading to a federal reform. This is the Trail of Broken Treaties, AIM's revolution, Nixon's reaction, and the government's reform. 1800s, America faced an era of manifest destiny, the concept that Americans had the divine right and duty to move west. However, this often meant tribes living in the desired areas were moved from their ancestral homelands. This came in the form of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This act, campaigned by President Andrew Jackson, forcibly relocated Native American tribes from the southeastern part of the United States. Its policy resulted in immense suffering and death, as seen on the infamous Trail of Tears. This led to an estimated 4,000 Cherokee deaths and set up generations of tribes to suffer due to the undesired territories' lack of natural resources, and the loss of much of their own historically important sites and artifacts. Forced into these new territories, these tribes endured systemic poverty, inadequate housing, and poor health, and faced decades of government neglect and broken promises. Generations later, many on reservations faced high unemployment, poverty rates, and a lack of basic infrastructure like indoor plumbing. A federal relocation policy had also pushed many Native Americans into cities, where they often experienced isolation and discrimination. Forced a century later, the descendants of these raw people decided to do something about their unjust loss. Forced galvanized and largely inspired by the successful nonviolent civil disobedient tactics of the civil rights movement, several leaders within the American Indian community met and planned out how they could address their concerns. Then, in July of 1968, the American Indian Movement, or AIM, was born. This organization will be a revolutionary response to the systemic issues Native Americans were currently facing during the time, including police brutality, racial profiling, forced housing, and high unemployment. They focused on border issues like tribal sovereignty, the enforcement of treaties, and the revitalization of Native American culture. AIM soon gained national prominence through highly publicized protests, such as the occupation of Alcatraz Island, where activists held a 19-month occupation of Alcatraz Island. They claimed the unused federal land under the terms of previous American-signed treaties. With several other mass protests, America was forced to listen. Forced in the autumn of 1972, leaders of AIM decided on a more direct approach to their demands. Together, they organized a caravan of protesters that would collect eastward across America, gaining members as they traveled. This journey began in St. Paul, Minnesota, with a destination of Washington, D.C. Along the way, they carried with them a promise and a burden. This was the Trail of Broken Treaties, a journey not of tears, but of resolve. They were not merely recounting history, they were delivering the accumulated weight of centuries of broken promises directly to the federal government's doorstep. The caravan gathered momentum and were joined by tribes along its route. Forced moves like a flowing river of resistance that carried with it a wave of demands called the 20-point position paper. This was a list of demands including a commission to review broken treaties, land reform in the form of restoring 110 million acre native land, and protection of Indians' religious and cultural integrity. Forced expectations written out, they arrived in D.C. Upon reaching the Capitol, the activists were met with a wall of indifference, and their promised meetings were canceled. Once again, the federal government failed to keep their promise, which further upset the activists. This spark of disrespect ignited a fiery 6-day standoff between protesters and the city's police. Forced out of defiance, protesters occupied the Bureau of Indian Affairs building, blockaded the police, and established a temporary base of operations. While inside, they discovered damning evidence of federal mismanagement and corruption. While this information should have been the primary focus of the press, the media fixated on images of property damage, ultimately distracting America from the core issue. In response to the revolution, President Richard Nixon carefully navigated the resistance. Seeking re-election, Nixon made sure not to repeat the mistakes of his previous leaders. During the Civil Rights Movement, protesters were depicted being blasted with fire hoses and being attacked by police dogs. In an attempt to avoid public embarrassment, Nixon had federal representatives speak with Ames leaders. Once informed of their 20-point position paper, Nixon promised to evaluate each point with his cabinet leaders. After 6 days of occupation, the Nixon administration negotiated a peaceful exit despite the damages. They offered travel funds up to $66,500. These protesters were also given immunity from prosecution for defacing federal property and occupying the BIA, despite the more than $700,000 of physical damages to the facility. The important impact of this movement resulted in officials agreeing to form a federal task force to review the 20-point position paper. However, even though they agreed to review the 20 points, the federal task force ultimately rejected the demands within months, stating that the government makes treaties with foreign nations, not its own citizens. Media outcome was frustrating. Their demands seeming rejected, the occupation sent a powerful message. As one leader famously put it, they had sent one hell of a smoke signal. It united indigenous nations like never before, laying the groundwork for a new era of Native American activism and inspiring later events like the occupation of Wounded Knee. The Trail of Broken Treaties was a loud, defiant step towards holding the government accountable for its past failures and demanding a just future. Keeping some of his promises, Nixon, still seeking re-election, met in person with representatives from these tribes. Together, they agreed on some level of reform. Documents such as the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975 was passed 3 years after the Trail of Broken Treaties. This act allowed tribes to take over the administration of federally funded programs so that they could play a more active role in their own education. They also established the Indian Healthcare Improvement of 1976, which addressed the chronic underfunding of Native American healthcare. Finally, with the help of the UN, modern-day activists helped establish the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007, based upon the 20 points position paper from the Trail of Broken Treaties. This organization sets up a global approach for how countries should treat their native population. Original American Indian movement, AIM, fractured decades ago, successor organizations continue to fight for indigenous rights today. Led by groups like the Minneapolis-based Ain Grand Governing Council, AIMGGC, modern activists advocate for a wide range of issues, including treaty rights, tribal sovereignty, and cultural preservation. They also support indigenous peoples worldwide and provide community services, though their efforts are sometimes complicated by internal disputes. Ultimately, AIM's revolution against the federal government's broken promises forced President Nixon to react, and in turn, forced reform in the form of several policies designed to tackle these detrimental issues. In fact, If you too wish to help our American Indian communities today, please join organizations such as National Congress of American Indians, NCAI, and Native American Connections, NAC. While our historical relationship with these tribes are scarred by broken treaties, perhaps today we can inspire positive change and dissolve decades of systematic oppression over time.